All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something our listeners, actually flagged for us. This is a collection of essays called The Curse of Demagogues, edited by Eli Merritt.
Oh, that's a great one.
Yeah, and it really is kind of a timely topic.
Absolutely.
And so these essays are written by scholars, journalists, legal experts, and they all explore this concept of the demagogue, especially, and this is where it gets interesting, especially as it relates to Donald J. Trump's presidency and kind of
Mm.
how he rose to power. And so our goal today is to kind of unpack what these authors are seeing as the key characteristics of a demagogue, maybe some historical precedents, and of course we got to talk about what potential threats they might pose to democratic institutions, right? Because that's what we're all kind of concerned about when we talk about demagogues.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's so fascinating about this particular collection is you've got all these different voices, right? People coming from academia, journalism, the legal field, and yet there's this really consistent thread of concern that runs through all of these essays. It really speaks to something fundamental about the challenges that democracies face, and I think this is an important conversation to be having right now, especially.
Absolutely. So let's just get right to the core of it. What are we even talking about? When we say the word demagogue, what does that even mean? The book reminds us that it comes from ancient Greek. It means, literally, leader of the people.
Right, which sounds pretty benign on the surface.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, okay.
Right. Follow me. Yeah.
But then we look at James Fenimore Cooper
Yeah.
back in the 1800s, and he was like, hold on a second. He had a very different take on this, and he kind of laid out four criteria, and I thought this was really interesting because it almost feels like it was written today, even though this was back in the 1800s. Right, right. And these criteria, they really seem to resonate even today when we think about figures who fit this description.
Yeah.
So first you have this idea that the demagogue postures as sort of a man or woman of the common people. They're one of us, right? They understand our struggles. They speak our language. Second, they're incredibly skilled at triggering powerful emotions.
Oh, yeah.
They know how to push buttons, how to get people fired up, whether it's through fear, anger, resentment, whatever works.
Mm-hmm.
Then third, and this is where it gets really sort of manipulative, they deliberately manipulate those emotions. They use them to gain political power, to advance their own agenda. And finally, and maybe this is the most dangerous part, they threaten or even break established principles of governance.
Yeah.
They don't play by the rules. They don't respect the norms. They're willing to do whatever it takes to get what they want.
And that last point, that's the one that I think really gives people pause, right? Because it's like, okay, if you're going to just ignore the rules, ignore the principles that we as a society have agreed upon, then that really does undermine the very foundation of how we operate, how we govern ourselves.
Absolutely. And it's really striking, the book makes this point that this concern, this fear of demagogues, it goes all the way back to the founding of the United States. I mean, the term demagogue comes up repeatedly during the Constitutional Convention.
Yeah, it's funny. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, these were brilliant minds, right? Madison, Hamilton, Jefferson, they were all wrestling with this idea of how to build a stable and just republic. And they were very aware of the dangers posed by demagogues, by these charismatic figures who could sway the masses with their rhetoric and their emotional appeals.
So it's not just some, theoretical or historical curiosity. Like this was a real concern that they baked into the very design of the government. It's almost like they were trying to build in safeguards.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, Madison, he believed that a larger republic with more diverse interests would actually help to dilute the influence of demagogues. He thought it'd be harder for one person to sort of capture the hearts and minds of the entire nation if there were all these competing factions and viewpoints. And then you have Hamilton, of course, in Federalist Number 1. He issues this really stark warning. He talks about how these charismatic leaders, they often start by flattering the people. They present themselves as the champions of the common man, but eventually they end up as tyrants. It's a pretty chilling prediction.
It is. And I think that's something that, we as modern readers of this, we can't help but think about, the modern day examples that we see. And that takes us right to I guess you could say, the elephant in the room. The person that these essays really focus on quite a bit is Donald J. Trump. And several of these contributors come right out and say, yeah, this is a demagogue. Like they're not pulling any punches.
Right. I mean, they analyze his presidency, his entire political career through this lens of demagoguery. And I think they make a pretty compelling case.
Okay, so let's dive into some of the specific strategies, some of the rhetorical techniques that they identify.
Well, one of the most consistent themes you see is this heavy reliance on emotional appeals. And often it's not just appealing to emotion, it's actually manipulating those emotions for political gain. The book breaks down several specific techniques that Trump used. One is the ad baculum argument, which is basically using threats of force or violence. They actually cite George Wallace back in 1968 when he said something to the effect of, if any demonstrator ever lays down in front of my car, it'll be the last car he'll ever lay down in front of.
Wow. I mean, that's a pretty direct and intimidating threat, isn't it?
Oh yeah, that's a very clear example of using fear and intimidation to silence opposition.
Right. And then there's another one that they talk about is the ad hominem attack. And that's where instead of actually addressing the substance of an argument or an idea or a policy, you go after the person. You attack their character. You call them names.
Right. And you know, the book gives the example of Senator Joseph McCarthy
Oh, yeah.
back in the 50s. He famously described Dean Acheson, who was the Secretary of State at the time, in these really just nasty personal terms. And they argue that Trump does the same thing repeatedly throughout his career, calling his opponents stupid, horrible, weak. It's all about discrediting the person rather than engaging with their ideas.
And it definitely felt like, at least from my perspective, and maybe you can speak to this as well, it felt like that was a pattern, right? Like it wasn't just a one-off. It was like almost a go-to move when he was confronted with something that he didn't like.
Absolutely. It was a way to distract from the actual issues and to appeal to people's emotions rather than their reason. And it worked to a certain extent, right? It got people riled up. It created this sort of us versus them mentality, which is really dangerous in a democracy.
Absolutely. Okay, so another one that they talk about is, this is a fascinating one, paralipsis. And this is where you bring up a topic, but you say, oh, I don't want to talk about that. Oh, it's so classic. But by saying that, you've actually just talked about it. You've planted the seed.
It's like the rhetorical equivalent of saying, I'm not going to mention the fact that you're wearing that ridiculous hat.
Right.
And it just makes everybody focus on the hat.
Right, exactly.
So the example the book gives is Trump saying something like, well, some people say these other candidates are weak, but I don't want to say that because I don't want to have any controversies. And it's just so brilliant in a way because it allows him to introduce this negative idea without actually taking responsibility for it.
Like, oh, I'm not saying it, but
wink, wink. You know what I mean?
I'm just putting it out there.
It's a way to sort of bypass people's critical filters.
Absolutely. And then another one that they talk about is ad populum. And this is where you basically say something is true because, well, everybody knows it's true.
Right. It's the common sense argument.
Common sense.
And of course, what's considered common sense can vary wildly depending on who you're talking to.
Right.
But by framing something as obvious, it makes it harder for people to question it, right? Because who wants to be the one who's out of touch with reality?
Right, right. Everybody knows that. Like, if you don't agree with that, then you must be, living under a rock or something.
Exactly. And then we get to maybe the most troubling of these rhetorical techniques, which is what the book calls essentializing and reification.
I know, those are some big words.
I know they sound kind of academic, but basically what it means is that you define entire groups of people in these really narrow negative ways, and then you treat them as objects rather than as individuals with their own unique experiences and perspectives.
Yeah, so it's dehumanizing.
Exactly. It's a way of stripping away people's humanity and making it easier to justify treating them badly. And the book points to a specific example of Trump doing this back in 2015 when he was talking about Muslims. He said something to the effect of, well, they believe only in jihad, and they use that instead of who when referring to them.
Yeah, that's very telling, isn't it?
It is. And the book also goes on to point out that the source he used for that statement was this really problematic survey from an organization called the Center for Security Policy, which is widely considered to be an anti-Muslim think tank. And not only that, he completely ignored other findings from the same survey that contradicted his point. So it's clear that he was cherry-picking information to fit his pre-existing narrative.
And so you see how this kind of rhetoric can then be used to kind of justify certain policies or certain actions, right?
Absolutely. It lays the groundwork for discrimination, for prejudice, for violence even.
Right.
And it's not just about Trump, right? This is something that we see throughout history. Demagogues, they all use these same kinds of tactics. They appeal to people's fears, they exploit existing prejudices, they dehumanize their opponents. And the scary thing is, it often works.
Yeah. So speaking of appealing to emotion and prejudice, Michael Gerson, he's quoted in the book saying, cynically exploiting fear is an art, and Trump is a Rembrandt of demagoguery. And the essays talk about how he specifically targeted undocumented Mexican immigrants and Muslims. I mean, it's like, was he choosing those groups because they were already kind of, there was already a lot of, I guess you could say, negative sentiment around those groups?
I think that's a very astute observation. Demagogues, they're very good at tapping into existing anxieties and resentments. They don't necessarily create those feelings out of whole cloth, but they exploit them, they amplify them, they turn them into political weapons. In the case of Trump, you had a lot of people who were already feeling economically insecure, culturally displaced, and he gave them someone to blame. He gave them an enemy to rally against.
The other.
Exactly. And once you've created that us versus them dynamic, it becomes very easy to justify all sorts of harmful policies and actions.
Another thing the book talks about is intolerance of criticism. And I think we saw this play out over and over again. Anytime somebody criticized Trump, he would immediately lash out. He would try to discredit them, to silence them.
Right. Demagogues, they can't handle criticism. They see it as a personal attack, as a threat to their power. And so they react very defensively. They try to undermine the legitimacy of their critics. They might call them fake news or enemies of the people. They might even threaten legal action, anything to shut them up. And the book brings up the example of Trump's attacks on President Obama, his whole birther conspiracy theory. It was a clear attempt to delegitimize his predecessor, to undermine his authority.
Right. And then, of course, you had his constant attacks on the media, on journalists who were critical of him.
Absolutely. He was constantly trying to paint the media as the enemy, as biased and untrustworthy. And he even talked about wanting to change libel laws to make it easier to sue journalists, which, a lot of people saw as a pretty blatant attempt to stifle free speech.
And then we get to the part that I think is the most worrying, which is the incitement, or at least the tolerance of violence. And the book cites several instances where Trump's words at rallies seem to almost encourage violence, Like he said at one point, talking about a protester, maybe she should have been roughed up a little bit.
Right. And he actually talked about wanting to punch a protester in the face.
In the face.
Yeah. And he used this very aggressive language all the time.
Right.
Like kill, destroy, fight. It was all about, crushing your opponents.
Yeah.
And it created this atmosphere where violence was seen as acceptable, even desirable.
And the book gives some really specific examples that I think are really telling. Like at one point, he was talking to a young girl who was expressing fear about the election.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
And he said, "You're not going to be scared anymore. They're going to be scared." Like he was almost like encouraging her to embrace fear and to project it onto others.
Right. And then there was that time when he said, if anybody throws tomatoes at me, just knock the crap out of them and I'll pay for your legal fees. I mean, that's pretty explicit, right? He's basically saying, go ahead and assault people who disagree with me and I've got your back.
And then we can't forget about his response to the white supremacists in Charlottesville, right?
Yeah.
His initial reluctance to condemn them, and then that stand back and stand by comment that he made to the Proud Boys during the debate. And the book points out that the Proud Boys themselves interpreted that as a sign of approval, which is pretty scary.
It is. It's like he was giving them permission to act, to carry out their violent agenda. And this gets to a really important point that Michael Siner makes in his essay, which is that there's a fundamental difference between populists and demagogues. Populists, they might play hardball, they might be very critical of elites, but they generally operate within the established rules of the game. Demagogues, on the other hand, they're intrinsically violent. They're willing to break the rules, to undermine democratic norms, to incite violence in order to achieve their goals. And Siner actually goes further and distinguishes between hard demagogues and soft demagogues. Hard demagogues are the ones who are really dangerous because they're not just talking about violence, they're actually carrying it out.
Okay, so let's talk about historical parallels, because the book does a really good job of placing Trump in a broader context. It's not just like he's this unique figure who came out of nowhere. It's like, no, there's actually a long history of this kind of leadership, both in the U.S. and around the world.
Right. I mean, demagoguery, it's a tale as old as time, right? It's been around since the dawn of democracy. And the book looks at both American and international examples.
Yeah.
So in terms of American history, they bring up figures like George Wallace, whose appeal to white resentment during the civil rights era really laid the groundwork for a lot of the strategies that we see being used today. And they talk about Joseph McCarthy, of course, with his Red Scare tactics, and Huey Long and Father Charles Coughlin. These were all figures who used fear prejudice, and emotional manipulation to gain power and to silence their opponents.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how those patterns keep repeating themselves, It's like we haven't really learned from the past. And then going even further back, the book talks about Cleon of Athens, who was this ancient Greek politician who was known for his fiery rhetoric and his appeals to the common man. And then, of course, you have Plato, who warned about how democracy could easily devolve into tyranny through the rise of demagogues. And Andrew Sullivan, in his essay, he draws a direct line from Plato's concerns to the present day. And I think, one of the most powerful quotes that comes up repeatedly in this book is from Alexander Hamilton in Federalist #1, where he warns about how demagogues, they start by flattering the people, but they end up as tyrants. And it's chilling to read that now, knowing what we know about Trump and about the events of January 6th.
It is, and it really makes you wonder, are we doomed to repeat these same mistakes over and over again? Are democracies inherently vulnerable to this kind of manipulation? And the book also looks at some contemporary international examples, like Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, who was this very charismatic, populist leader who used his control of the media to consolidate power and to silence dissent. And then you have Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus, who is often referred to as Europe's last dictator. He's been clinging to power for decades, using rigged elections and brutal repression to stay in control. And I think these examples show us that demagoguery, it's not just an American problem, it's a global problem. It's a threat to democracy everywhere.
Yeah. And, one of the things that the book explores is how democratic systems themselves might actually create openings for demagogues. And this is a really interesting idea. Like, it's not just that there are these bad actors out there who are trying to exploit the system. It's that the system itself might have certain vulnerabilities that make it easier for demagogues to gain power.
Right. And Andrew Sullivan, in his essay, he talks about how several trends in modern democracies have actually weakened traditional safeguards against demagoguery. He points to things like the rise of more direct forms of democracy.
Like referendums, things like that.
Right, where people are voting directly on issues rather than electing representatives to make those decisions for them.
Yeah.
And while that might sound good in theory, it can actually be problematic because it can bypass the sort of deliberative process that's supposed to happen in a representative democracy.
Right.
And he also talks about the decline of traditional gatekeepers, like political parties and mainstream media. These institutions used to play a really important role in filtering out extreme or dangerous candidates, but they've lost a lot of their power and influence in recent years.
So the internet, social media, all that kind of stuff.
It's exactly. The rise of social media, the fragmentation of the media landscape, all of this has created a situation where it's much easier for demagogues to bypass traditional gatekeepers and to reach people directly with their message. And he also points to the decline of what he calls peer review in the selection of political candidates. He argues that in the past, political parties would vet candidates very carefully. They would look at their experience, their qualifications, their temperament.
Right.
But nowadays, you have a lot more people running for office who don't have that traditional political background. They might be celebrities, they might be business people, they might just be, really good at self-promotion.
Yeah, or they might just have a huge following on Twitter or TikTok or whatever.
Right. And that's not to say that everyone who comes from outside of the traditional political establishment is a demagogue. But it does create a situation where it's easier for people who are more interested in personal power than in public service to gain a foothold. And he points to figures like Wendell Willkie, Ross Perot, and of course Trump himself as examples of this trend.
It's almost like the filters that were in place before are no longer as effective. Right.
Right. And I think it's also important to acknowledge the role that economic anxiety and social alienation play in the rise of demagogues. The book talks about Eric Hoffer's theory from The True Believer, where he argues that mass movements often arise from a sense of frustration and resentment among people who feel like they've been left behind, who feel like the system isn't working for them.
Okay.
And I think you see this very clearly in the case of Trump. He appealed to a lot of people who were feeling economically insecure, who were worried about losing their jobs, who felt like their way of life was under threat. And he gave them someone to blame. He gave them an enemy to rally against. He told them that the elites, the immigrants, the minorities, they were all conspiring to take away what was rightfully theirs.
Make America great again.
Exactly. And that message resonated with a lot of people who were feeling angry and disillusioned. And I think it's also important to acknowledge the role that the media plays in all of this. The book talks about how television, for example, through shows like The Apprentice, played a role in shaping Trump's public persona.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah. He was portrayed as this successful businessman, this tough negotiator, this decisive leader. And that image resonated with a lot of people, even though it was largely a fabrication. And then, of course, you have the role of social media, which has been absolutely transformative in terms of how political information is disseminated and consumed. Social media allows demagogues to bypass traditional gatekeepers, to reach people directly with their message, and to create these echo chambers where people are only exposed to information that confirms their existing
And it
biases.
creates these sort of like tribes, right? Like these online communities where people are constantly reinforcing each other's beliefs, no matter how extreme or unfounded those beliefs might be.
Exactly. And that makes it very difficult to have a reasoned, productive conversation about politics because everyone is just shouting past each other and nobody's really listening. And the book also points out that traditional news organizations have really struggled to effectively counter Trump's lies and distortions, partly because he was very good at delegitimizing the media, at calling them fake news and enemies of the people, and partly because he cultivated this very loyal following among conservative media outlets like Fox News, who were willing to amplify his message and to defend him no matter what.
So it's a very complex ecosystem, and I think the book does a really good job of teasing out all of these different factors that contribute to the rise of demagogues. But let's talk about the threats, right? Like what specifically are the dangers that demagogues pose to democratic institutions? Because that's really the core issue here.
Absolutely. I mean, why should we even care about demagogues? Why are they a threat to our democracy? Well, the authors identify several key dangers. And the first one is the erosion of norms and laws. Michael Siner, he argues that demagogues, they basically obliterate the rules that allow normal governance. They don't respect the rule of law. They don't respect democratic norms. They're willing to do whatever it takes to get what they want.
So you're saying like the guardrails are gone.
Exactly. And that's a really dangerous situation to be in because it creates a lot of uncertainty and instability. And the book points to Trump's behavior as a prime example of this. You know, he repeatedly attacked the independence of the judiciary. He threatened political opponents. He questioned the legitimacy of elections. He basically did everything he could to undermine faith in democratic institutions. And that's incredibly corrosive because democracy relies on a certain level of trust, a certain level of shared understanding about how the system is supposed to work.
Right. Like we all agree to play by the rules, even if we don't always like the outcome.
Exactly. But when those rules start to break down, when people start to lose faith in the system, that's when things can get really dangerous.
Okay, so what else? What other threats do they talk about?
Well, another big one is the cult of personality. Demagogues, they often cultivate these very intense personal followings where loyalty to the leader becomes the most important thing, even more important than facts or truth or the good of the country. And one essay in the book actually uses the term cult to describe Trump's base of support. And, I think that's a pretty apt description because there was this real sense that his followers were willing to believe anything he said, no matter how outlandish or unfounded it might be.
It's like the facts didn't matter anywhere.
Exactly. It was all about belief. It was all about faith in the leader. And, we saw this play out over and over again. Like his insistence that the 2020 election was stolen, despite all the evidence to the contrary. Millions of people believed him because they wanted to believe him, because he was their leader, and they trusted him more than they trusted anyone else.
And that's scary, right? Because when you have a situation where people are no longer willing to accept basic facts or to engage in reasoned debate, that's when democracy really starts to break down.
Absolutely. Because democracy relies on this shared understanding of reality, on this ability to have a conversation, to disagree, to compromise.
Mm.
But when that shared understanding is gone, when facts don't matter anymore, then you're really in trouble. And then I think the most frightening threat of all is the potential for violence and instability. The book argues that demagogues, they often incite or at least tolerate violence, and that this can lead to social unrest, political instability, and even civil war.
And I think, after January 6th, it's hard to argue with that point.
Right. I mean, January 6th was a really stark example of what can happen when a demagogue whips up a mob and encourages them to attack the very heart of our democracy. And the book points out that a lot of the people who participated in the attack on the Capitol were believers in QAnon conspiracy theories, and they were members of far-right extremist groups. And these are the kinds of people who are most susceptible to demagogic appeals. They're the ones who are most likely to be drawn to violence.
Right, because they're already predisposed to see the world in these very black and white terms, right? They see everything as a battle between good and evil, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to defeat the enemy, even if it means resorting to violence. And I think it's also important to remember that Trump didn't just incite violence on January 6th, he had been doing it for years. He had been encouraging his supporters to rough up protesters at his rallies. He'd been using this very violent language all the time. And I think that created a climate where violence became more acceptable, more normalized.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to hold him accountable for that. Because if we don't, if we just let this slide, then it sends a message that this kind of behavior is okay. And it makes it more likely that we'll see more of it in the future. And finally, the book talks about how demagogues can weaken constitutional checks and balances. The founders, they were very aware of the dangers posed by demagogues, and they designed the Constitution in a way that was supposed to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power.
Right, like the separation of powers, checks and balances, all that stuff.
Exactly. But the book argues that those safeguards, they're not foolproof.
Uh-huh.
And they've been under a lot of strain in recent years. And they point to the Electoral College as an example. The Electoral College was originally designed to be a deliberative body, where electors could potentially act as a check on the popular will if a dangerous demagogue were to gain widespread support. But in practice, the Electoral College has become more of a rubber stamp. And in 2016, it actually allowed Trump to win the presidency, even though he lost the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes.
Yeah, and that's something that a lot of people are still very upset about, right? Because it feels like it undermines the principle of one person, one vote.
Absolutely. It raises some really serious questions about the future of our democracy.
Mm-hmm.
If a demagogue can win the presidency without winning the popular vote, then what's to stop them from consolidating power and eroding democratic norms even further? And I think that's the question that a lot of people are grappling with right now.
So the book doesn't just focus on Trump, right? It also talks about the aftermath, and it kind of looks to the future a little bit.
Right. I mean, we're still living in the shadow of Trump's presidency. And I think it's really important to grapple with the legacy of what happened and to think about what we can do to prevent something like this from happening again. And the book talks a lot about the January 6th attack, which is repeatedly referenced as this really pivotal moment in American history. Jeff Flake, in his essay, he contrasts the peaceful transfer of power in 2001 with the violence and chaos of January 6th. And he sees it as a direct result of his party's embrace of Trump, of their willingness to turn a blind eye to his demagoguery.
Yeah, and James Risen, he actually calls January 6th an insurrection that was incited by Trump. And I think a lot of people would agree with that assessment.
Absolutely. And there's a real sense of urgency in these essays, a sense that we need to do something to prevent this from happening again. And they talk a lot about the importance of accountability, of holding Trump and his enablers responsible for their actions. And they discuss the impeachment of Trump, with several authors arguing that he should have been removed from office and disqualified from holding future office. And I think that's a really important point, because if we don't hold people accountable for their actions, then it sends a message that it's okay to violate the law, to undermine democracy, to incite violence.
Right, like there are no consequences.
Exactly. And that's a really dangerous precedent to set. And the book also talks about the role of political leaders and parties in preventing demagogues from gaining power in the first place. They cite the work of Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, who wrote How Democracies Die.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that book.
Yeah, it's a really important book. And they argue that one of the key indicators of a healthy democracy is the willingness of political elites to act as gatekeepers, to prevent extremists from gaining a foothold in mainstream political parties. And they point to examples from other countries where democracies have collapsed because political parties were too weak or too divided to stand up to demagogues. And I think that's a really important lesson for us to learn from, because we're seeing a similar dynamic play out in the U.S. right now. The Republican Party has been largely taken over by Trump and his supporters, and they've shown very little willingness to push back against his most dangerous rhetoric and actions. And that's a really worrying sign.
Yeah. It's like they've been completely captured by this cult of personality.
Exactly. And it raises some really serious questions about the future of the party and about the future of American democracy.
And so even though the book is very critical of elites in a lot of ways, it ultimately argues that they still have a really important role to play in safeguarding democracy. It's like, yes, we need to hold elites accountable. We need to be wary of their power. But we also need them to act responsibly, to uphold democratic norms, to defend the institutions that protect us from tyranny.
Right. It's a really delicate balance. Because on the one hand, we don't want to just blindly trust elites. We need to hold them accountable. We need to make sure that they're serving the public interest. But on the other hand, we also need to recognize that they have a certain expertise, a certain experience that can be valuable in protecting democracy.
Hmm.
And I think the book makes a really compelling case for why we need to find a way to strike that balance. And finally, the essays touch on this idea that popular support is fickle. They quote Niccolo Machiavelli, who said that the populace is fickle, and it is easy to persuade them of something, but difficult to keep them persuaded.
Okay, so what's the takeaway there? Like, demagogues can't just rely on their charisma forever.
Right. They need to constantly be reinforcing their message. They need to constantly be finding new enemies to rally against, new fears to exploit. And that's a really exhausting and ultimately unsustainable way to govern. In Machiavelli.